Thank you very much, and good afternoon. I want to really keep the spirit of going fast but thoroughly through what I have to say. I think that we are in an exceptional year in world history when at least 16 countries on the African continent celebrate 50 years of independence. It was particularly the method of that independence that defined that burgeoning decolonized world as the third world. In the definition of the Abbé Sieyès, who defined the third estate, that it represented everything but was nothing. And for a long time that was true of Africa, because arbitrary borders united the most divergent and divided the most coherent. That extraction became the raison d'etre of the decolonized Africa, and Africa became the theater of the Cold War. And if you don't understand that, you will not understand the remarkable achievements that we are able to speak about today. It was that perpetual dream of Africa to unite and to solve its own problems that troubled Kwame Nkrumah, that troubled Nelson Mandela and every other African leader. But it was only when the last piece of the puzzle fell in place, when apartheid South Africa fell, that Africa could turn its dreams into a philosophical construct under the African Renaissance, give it institutional form in the African Union, and give it programmatic direction through the new plan for Africa's development. And it is Africa since then that we need to evaluate. The diaspora, the African diaspora, needs to be participants and active agents in changing the perspective of Africa as a continental conflict zone, despite the most disastrous conflicts that persist. It is the diaspora that must change Africa's viewpoint, or the perception of Africa as one major quagmire of poverty and underdevelopment, despite the dire necessity to overcome poverty, disease, malnutrition, and a range of other things. Today, when we speak of Africa, we speak of far more optimism. There are less than 5 dangerous armed conflicts on the African continent today. Over 90% of elections held over the last few years have been safe. Where election results have been contested, they have been mediated in constructive ways. Leadership transitions are increasingly seamless. Presidents are actually stepping down. Institutions of state and society are being built. Increasingly in Africa, we see the building of the 3 foundations that make any investor or business leader want to come to Africa. We are seeing firstly the establishment of the rule of law increasingly across Africa, an internationally justiciable legal system. Whether you're in Africa or in America, you can be using that system. And globally integrated banking systems are increasingly the norm in Africa. That has allowed for improved macroeconomic management of the African economies as inflation gets lower, foreign debt is reduced, deficits are managed downwards, and the cost and ease of doing business in Africa is improving. If you want to see the rate at which Africa is entering the digital age, then consider that since the year 2000, there have been 316 million new telephone, cell phone, and internet subscribers in Africa since the year 2000. This is the rock on which the African potential is growing. What we are seeing in Africa are things that are not generally understood because conflict, disasters dominate the mind. But if you consider that Africa's economic growth rate as a continent exceeded 5% last year in the midst of a global recession and is 2 to 3 times faster than growth rates in the OECD countries. Consider secondly that Central Africa's oil boom spurred a 14.4% growth rate for that region. Consider thirdly that Ghana's stock exchange is regularly one of the highest performing stock exchanges in the world. Consider fourthly, that in 2008, Africa's households spent a combined 816 billion US dollars, more than is spent in India or in Russia, and is set to rise to 1.4 trillion. I want to say to you, finally, that there is, on the basis of that empirical statistics and the basis of a description of how conflict is reducing and how the rule of law is expanding, there is a world of partnerships and joint ventures that can share risk and share gains, with 20 homegrown African companies, each with revenues of at least 3 billion US dollars. There is comfort in a continent embracing democracy, expanding the rule of law, deepening economic development as the only sustainable way to overcome our legacy of poverty and underdevelopment. Investing in that continent, given the good conditions that is there, is the only way to ensure also global security across the world and in the United States. It is the responsibility for the African diaspora to be the purveyors of the good news as we continue to be concerned about the bad news. Thanks very much.
Darius Manns has, since the beginning of this year, been president of AfriCare, which, as many of you know, is engaged in development all across the continent. He came to AfriCare from the Millennium Challenge Corporation, where he ended up as acting CEO. Before that, he was at the World Bank and the Federal Reserve. We welcome him to the podium today.
Well, thank you all very much, and good morning to you all. I wonder how many of you have actually heard of AfriCare? Oh, excellent. Well, this is a very big year for us. It's our 40th anniversary. Over the past 4 decades, we've provided about $1 billion of direct assistance in Africa, in 35 countries where we have helped to improve the lives of millions. Today, I was asked to talk about the work that we're doing in creating economic and social opportunity for women. So I'd like to spend a few minutes to share with you what we're doing overall and to give you an example of some of the work that we're doing in Chad in particular, in the voices of the women themselves, through a very short 2-minute DVD at the end. But for AfriCare, we recognize that women's development is absolutely fundamental to Africa's overall development. As you all know, women bear a disproportionate burden of Africa's poverty. 70% of the poverty head count is women. In addition, we know that women produce roughly 80% of agricultural output, but women earn only 10% of income and own only 1% of property in Africa. We also know that today the face of AIDS in Africa is that of a woman. Women constitute 60% of people living with HIV. And of all Africans aged 15 to 24 who are HIV positive, 75% are young women. When you look at the Millennium Development Goals, and there will be lots of discussion about this next week in New York, we know that there's going to be a shortfall on so many of the MDGs. But key to meeting the MDGs will be to have targeted programs and strategies that are focused specifically on women. Now at AfriCare, projects that directly involve women in the implementation process, women from day one in setting out what are the priorities for AfriCare's involvement, getting women involved as volunteers to actually execute these programs is absolutely at the core of our approach to supporting development of the continent. We focus heavily on what we can do to try and enhance women's knowledge, to provide the skills that they need to be successful, and to improve their status in the community. Because as we all know, it is the best investment that you can possibly make. To uplift women, it helps not only them as individuals, but the role that they play in lifting up their families and their communities as a whole. So we do a lot of work in training women on crop diversification, vocational skills, entrepreneurship development. We provide startup capital, startup equipment for women to go into business for themselves. We help women to acquire access to finance through savings and loans associations down at the community level. We are doing a number of activities across the continent to empower women. I'd like to show you just a short video, 2 minutes, so that you can hear the women talk about this themselves. Oh, it seemed perhaps not.
No.
The video, they were not able to do it. But then let me tell you the story. This is a project in Chad where we have been working together with government. As you know, ExxonMobil is financing a number of activities in Chad in the oil and gas sector. This project brings together the private sector, the central government and local governments to provide opportunity for women. In this project, what we have done is helped women to form savings and loans associations so that they can begin to go into business for themselves, providing them vocational training skills in a variety of areas, including how to reduce post-harvest losses, how to improve yields for grain production, milling of grains so that they can do a much better job of feeding themselves and have a commodity for sale that generates income. In this project, which has been operating now for the past 5 years, we now have a number of women who have formed associations, cooperatives, who've gone from this as a side business, something that they did just to earn a little pocket money, to now as a thriving cooperative movement that is employing other women, teaching women the kinds of business skills that they need to be successful. And I really regret that you cannot hear this from the women themselves, but if you go to our website, www.africare.org, you will find it featured there. Thank you.
Our next speaker, Cassandra Butts, comes from the Millennium Challenge Corporation, where she's a senior advisor. She served for the first year of the Obama administration as Deputy White House Counsel, where she focused on judicial nominations. She worked on the Obama-Biden Transition Project, and prior to that was at the Center for American Progress. As someone who worked with Sandy when she first engaged with Africa, I'm glad to welcome her to the podium to tell us about Millennium Challenge Corporation and its activities in Africa.
You can tell that I've known Reed for a while because he called me Sandy, yes. which family and old friends do. Reed and Tammy, Reed's wife, actually gave me my first job out of college, working for African News Service, and it has had a profound impact on my thinking and on my interests in the continent. So thank you for that, Reed. I also want to recognize, this is a wonderful panel, but I also want to recognize my friend and former colleague, Darius Mons, who was in the leadership of the Millennium Challenge Corporation, actually led the Millennium Challenge Corporation during the transition from the Bush administration to the Obama administration. And we are where we are in our ability to move forward because of Darius's leadership. Thank you, Darius. I also want to thank, of course, Congressman Payne, who has been a big supporter of the Millennium Challenge Corporation. I last saw Congressman Payne actually in Monrovia, Liberia, where we were signing a compact, or I should say, a threshold program with Liberia. Liberia is on its way. It's not quite there at the compact level, but we signed a threshold program with Liberia in July, a $15 million threshold program with Liberia that is investing in Liberia's development focused on trade policy, also girls' education, and also trade policy, girls' education, and land access. So Don Payne has been a great supporter of the Millennium Challenge Corporation, and we certainly appreciate that. I'm very pleased to be with you today, and what I will do is I will share my prepared remarks, and I look forward to the discussion afterwards. Let me put MCC's work into context. It should be no secret to this audience that the United States as a whole is committed to Africa. As President Obama said during his historic visit to Ghana, global prosperity is tied to Africa's prosperity. America's own prosperity and security are linked with that of developing countries, including those in Africa. For this reason, the Obama administration is focusing policies and programs in Africa on 5 key principles: democracy and governance, conflict mitigation, economic growth and development, health, transnational issues such as terrorism, illicit drug trafficking, and climate change. The work of the Millennium Challenge Corporation is a critical component of the U.S. government's focus on economic growth and development. And let there be no mistake about MCC's commitment. The numbers speak for themselves. Of MCC's entire portfolio, $5.2 billion, or 70%, the vast majority, benefit the people of Africa. The continent is the largest recipient of MCC grants. We have active compacts in 11 countries and have funded smaller threshold programs in 9 countries. Our grants fund African-designed and implemented reform programs and projects in a wide range of sectors, including agriculture, transportation, education, healthcare, power, finance, and land management. African partners are investing nearly 60% of their total MCC grants in transportation and agriculture, vital sectors for long-term growth, food security, and trade. And MCC's mandate to reduce poverty through economic growth in Africa underpins progress in all the Millennium Development Goals. Only with sustained increases in income can families overcome poverty and meet their basic needs in terms of health, education, equal opportunity for women and girls. Yet our commitment to Africa exceeds even the sheer magnitude of our financial assistance. It is also grounded in MCC's innovative way toward development assistance that creates sustainable conditions for growth in Africa that extend well beyond the life of any grant funding we may provide. MCC's emphasis on good governance, country ownership, accountability for results also lays the groundwork for sustainable development well beyond meeting the MDGs by 2015. Our model is performance-based, so we partner with countries that are taking on tough work of reforming their policies, fighting corruption, practicing good governance, investing in the health and education of their citizens, and creating favorable investment climates. In fact, MCC's investment in Africa represents a good news story for the continent as it identifies African partner countries that have made commitments to sound policies. Our model demands results. We want to work with countries that embrace the accountability, transparency, and responsibility necessary to deliver tangible results for our investment of U.S. tax dollars. And it is central to our work that achieving these results also mean that women and girls are included in the solutions. As the Millennium Challenge Corporation's point person for the integration of gender equality in the programs we fund, I firmly believe that the results we seek from every MCC project require that women and men be equal champions in their development. In Lesotho, for example, we worked to ensure that gender equality and economic rights was legally guaranteed before we made our investment. This led to the passage of the Legal Capacity of Married Persons Act. Before the new law, married women in Lesotho were considered legal minors and could not enter into contracts, incur a debt, register property in their name, or buy, sell, or use property as collateral without permission from their husbands or male relatives. The Gender Equality Project, funded through Lesotho's MCC Compact, is conducting training on this new law to explain the benefits of gender equality to the country's long-term development and economic growth. And what sets MCC's model of development apart is that partner countries themselves determine how best to invest their MCC grants to meet pressing development priorities. This approach creates solutions by and for Africans. In large number, African countries themselves are choosing to invest their MCC grants in infrastructure as a core development solution. Landlocked African countries, for example, cannot trade regionally or globally if they do not have reliable infrastructure to move their goods efficiently. Yet only about 30% of sub-Saharan African roads are paved. As a result, poor transportation links within and between countries are crippling Africa's competitiveness. It's no wonder that most of MCC's partner countries have chosen to invest in infrastructure for their economic development and growth. That's why more than $3.5 billion of MCC grants are invested in African roads, ports, bridges, airports, necessary for productive capacity. And let me give you just a few examples, and then I'll close. Tanzania is investing in trunk roads to increase commerce, connecting the seaport of Tanga with Horohoro at the Kenyan border to reach the major port of Mombasa. And Darius is very familiar with this because he was definitely one of our leads in putting this compact together. Mali, a landlocked country that depends on air routes for trade, is investing part of its MCC grant to improve its airports, increase freight and passenger traffic. This includes making the institutional changes to ensure the effective management, operation, and maintenance of the improved airport over the long term. And I was actually very fortunate. My first trip with MCC was actually to Mali to see the work that we're doing there. And that was actually in February of this year. And I'm very pleased to say that we actually laid the cornerstone for the new airport in Mali just a few weeks ago, which is an astounding accomplishment. And Darius smiles because he knows that it took some effort on our part, but particularly on the Malians' part, to get from where we were at the beginning of the compact to where we are now. So that is an amazing achievement. And we still have a ways to go, but it was a very important accomplishment. Mozambique is investing its MCC grant in water supply and sanitation projects, a critical part of a community's basic infrastructure. This will provide access to safe, reliable water and sanitation services to increase productivity and reduce waterborne diseases. This will also move the country closer to achieving the MDGs of expanding safe drinking water. And there are a number of other examples that I can give. We're doing great work in Ghana particularly, and it is one of our showcase projects. But let me conclude by saying that our MCC partnership throughout Africa, our MCC partnerships throughout Africa are adding to the continent's progress. MCC's approach is a catalyst for reform and private sector-led development. We can and are creating stronger economies in Africa by motivating sound policies. We are helping African countries achieve the MDGs. We are expanding trade capacity and engaging the private sector for the long term. And building Africa's infrastructure is one tangible way that we can surely promote economic growth. This will move us closer, both figuratively and literally, to achieving our shared vision for global prosperity and economic growth that benefits all Americans and Africans alike. Thank you.
One more reminder to submit your questions. They'll be collected at the end of the aisles as we hear the final speaker on this economic panel. Walter Crawford Jones is the United States Executive Director of the African Development Bank. He's been in that position since April. He spent the past 20 years in international development, business, law, and finance. Before the African Development Bank, he was at the Overseas Private Investment Corporation and has had a number of other important positions. I welcome him to the podium.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. I would also like to thank the CBC and Congressman Payne for inviting me here, as well as the staff who helped me tremendously logistically. Stephen and Noel and Algene got the information out to me in a prompt manner, and I was a little bit late in getting my information to you, so I apologize, and thank you very much. You did a great job. I don't have prepared remarks, and the benefit of being the last speaker is that I can kind of pick up on some of the themes that have been mentioned and raised by the panel that we have and kind of punctuate them with, in terms of my experience at the African Development Bank, and describe what the bank is doing. But first, let me do a little bit of housekeeping and explain exactly what the position is that I have the honor to hold. The position of the U.S. Executive Director at the bank is a political appointment. And you, or the person in that position, represents the United States at the bank and on the board of directors for the bank and the African Development Fund, which together comprise the African Development Group. So I have the honor to be in that position and to represent American citizens and companies. It needs to be a little, how's that? Thank you. So I have that position now as long as the President wants me to have the position. And I am there to help promote bank effectiveness as well as to assure that the United States has a meaningful role or continues to play a meaningful role in the bank. So let me just very briefly touch on some of the points that the panelists raised and explain how the African Development Bank is helping to helping the continent to achieve the great future that it has and many of the opportunities that the ambassador has pointed out. And in particular, I want to touch on three sectors: roads, transportation, electricity, and kind of climate change as three broad topics. The ambassador was very good in pointing out the opportunities in Africa. Africa presents for investors in particular, which is kind of my expertise, is investment and finance, probably the single best area to achieve a meaningful return on an investment. Rates here in the United States and other developed countries are low. Real rates are particularly close to zero. And so Africa presents an opportunity to really yield a meaningful return on investments. Now, some of the impediments to actually achieve those returns are part of the things that the African Development Bank is focusing on. About 2 or so years ago, 2 to 3 years ago, the bank made a critical decision, a strategic decision, to focus on areas where it felt it had a comparative advantage. So broadly speaking, infrastructure was an area where the bank said, let's kind of focus our resources there. We're not particularly good in agriculture in terms of helping farmers plant and providing expertise in that area, but we can support agriculture through infrastructure, because when you grow plants and crops, you have to have roads so that you can have those crops access markets. So from its support for infrastructure, the bank is in fact helping areas such as agricultural development, because it's creating the means to get goods to markets and in fact creating new regional markets and helping to promote regional integration for goods and services. Now, in the investment framework, you have capital markets, which the ambassador mentioned, the strong performance of the Ghanaian Stock Exchange. The JSE, the Johannesburg Stock Exchange, also is in the forefront of performance and has been for years, and is an excellent exchange, world-class exchange in every respect. But underpinning capital markets is the ability to transfer information effectively, because that is the basis of pricing, which drives the capital markets and share transfers and investment. At a very fundamental level, you have to have a functioning infrastructure to be able to have functioning capital markets. Key to that, obviously, is electricity. Currently, Africa has a dearth of electricity to meet its prospective growth needs and, in fact, its current needs as well. If you look at it in the aggregate, you take the sub-Saharan African countries, and their electrical output is roughly equivalent to Spain. And Spain has about 1/5 of the population. So there is tremendous margin for growth in the electricity sector. And the African Development Bank in particular is helping to foster that growth by financing projects, be it in the natural gas as the fuel, or perhaps in hydro projects. So there are a range of energy producing projects that the African Development Bank is focusing on, has focused on, and will continue to do so as part of its near and medium term objectives. Now in the area of transportation, I kind of alluded to it a little bit with respect to agriculture, but to have functioning regional integration, which is one of the goals, and I think one of the objectives to be able to achieve scale for market and investment purposes, you have to have a means of traveling between countries effectively. And I think we've all heard stories how sometimes it's easier to travel from one African country to another by transiting in Europe. Well, the African Development Bank recognizes this and has led in many respects the effort to finance regional and local transportation projects, one being the airport of Dakar that will open hopefully pretty soon. I think it is just at the final testing stages. And the goal is to help Dakar become a hub, a regional hub, which certain airlines, I think Delta has already recognized that and is starting to offer feeder services. But once this airport opens, it will be able to make Dakar a truly viable hub for transportation. And with that comes goods and services. There is a flow of individuals that can pass through a country. Potential investors can arrive and leave very quickly because time is money. And so just by having a world-class airport, that will propel Dakar back to, those of you who remember the 70s when the Concorde would fly to Dakar between Paris and Rio de Janeiro. And it will help this airport, this project financed by the AFDB, should and will help Dakar kind of regain that world-class status in terms of transportation. So those are some of the key areas where the bank is working to promote overall infrastructure development in Africa, and the objectives and the goals and the needs are tremendous. Over the next 3 to 5 years, at least $31 billion in new infrastructure investment is required, and just since 2007 up to probably the end of 2009, because 2010 figures are yet to be put together, the bank invested $11 billion just in infrastructure projects alone. So there is tremendous growth, tremendous opportunities for American companies, tremendous opportunities for U.S. investors, particularly as the capital markets continue to develop. So I think I'll stop there because it's better to get the participation from the audience. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Well, we covered a lot of territory again. Algene, are you going to read a question, or are you giving them to me? Okay. Either way. We have time for several questions before President Salva Kiir joins us for the final session. This is a question about the Millennium Challenge Corporation. Can the new mandate allow it to work on regional basis and not just on, with the regional economic communities, not just on a country by country?
That's a very good question. Can you hear me? Okay. But I'm not sure about the new. I'm not sure the new mandate. It is an issue that we've been looking at, and it's wonderful actually to have Darius sitting next to me, because he's been looking at this for a while. I kind of picked up where he left off. We've been looking at this for a while. Our focus has been on working with individual countries rather than looking across regions. And we are able to have compacts with individual countries. Certainly, looking across regions, if we're looking to promote economic growth, makes sense. But we've been challenged in thinking about, how we connect countries in a region that have different policy performances. One of the things that distinguishes the work that we do at MCC is that we're selective in choosing countries. And the countries, as I indicated in my remarks, have to show that they are interested in the kind of policy reforms that we believe will lead to sustainable economic growth and policy reduction, and poverty reduction. So the countries that we work with have to show that they are at the level where they actually are doing the policy reforms that we want to see. We certainly are working with countries within regions, and in the countries that are in the same region. For example, we work with Tanzania. We're in the process of doing a compact development in Malawi. My colleague Deidre Fair, who is leading that effort, is in the audience. And one of the issues that we're actually working on with Malawi is actually electricity. So we do work with countries that are within regions, but we haven't quite taken the step. We're looking into it, but we haven't quite taken the step to actually working across regions. And we're looking at some of the logistical questions of how, what country, what would be the implementing partner? Our implementing partners now are within countries. If you're working across regions, who is the implementing partner? How do you manage that? We're also looking to get more congressional support for that, quite frankly. It would be something new that we believe we have the ability to do within our legislative mandate, but we haven't quite taken that step. But it is something that we're looking into. My colleague Darius, do you want to?
Oh, yeah, perfect.
Okay.
She covered it. All right. Next question is directed to Mr. Jones and the panel, and it has to do with the role of private equity. Are there equity or venture funds engaged in Africa in development, particularly on infrastructure? And if so, can you mention some of them? And maybe others know about it too, but we'll start with you, Mr. Jones.
Thank you for the question. I will mention some, but please don't consider it as an endorsement of those funds. But the short answer is yes, they are definitely PE funds and to a lesser extent venture capital funds operating in Africa. And I'm talking about extra-regional, US, UK, French, other non-African funds, PE funds that are operating in Africa. The number is growing, and back to the comment I made about looking for return, looking for alpha, Africa presents an area where you can achieve meaningful returns. I mean, Africa grew at about 4 to 6% throughout this economic meltdown that we've had. And so it stands out as the one region that has sustained growth. And with that comes opportunities. You have an emerging middle class with disposable income, which by definition is going to demand consumer goods. So consumer items, consumables are a logical sector, and PE funds recognize that, and so there are investments in those sectors as well. Communications is another one where PE funds, and I'm thinking, again, this is not an endorsement, but the Helios Fund based in London has, I think, raised their third fund now to invest in communications, mobile phones. Everyone knows about the examples of mobile phones. But to have mobile phones, you need towers, and there's a whole separate business of owning and leasing out towers, and even the real estate in certain cases where those towers are located. Those have provided in sometimes triple-digit returns. I mean, MTN, South African company, has done extremely well in the mobile communications sector. So the short answer is yes, PE funds are there. I've heard rumors, and I'm not going to pass on rumors, but of other major PE funds that are looking at Africa very seriously. And in fact, the World Cup, the success of the World Cup really has helped bring positive attention not only to South Africa, but to the potential of the whole continent. And anecdotally, that has resulted in PE firms hopping on planes and going there to look. Thank you.
Yeah, go ahead, Ambassador.
Just for a few seconds, and again, I'm going to do it without mentioning any names, because otherwise you could be accused of touting. But I think that one would very easily be willing to engage on the availability of even African-grown funds. I think after the World Cup, many of the inquiries that came particularly to me was about Middle Eastern sovereign funds wanting agents for sub-agents of part of their own portfolios in Africa, and the and the direction that was taken with me is how can we locate this in the safety of South Africa, but for deployment of those funds across sub-Saharan Africa. And I think that that is increasingly becoming a very major proposition, and I think together with the 20 homegrown corporates with a turnover of 3 billion, I think that the possibility of those returns on investments are enormous. Both the McKinsey 2010 report as well as the World Bank report have described returns on investments in Africa as outstripping anything else in the developing world, and I think increasingly also in the developed world. So I think that this is the moment in which we can make that switch from Africa as a basket case to Africa as an investment and trade destination.
Well, just to pick up on that a little bit, and this question has to do with the role that the diaspora can play in Africa, but specifically in South Africa, Ambassador. Can you talk about specific programs or industries that diaspora can participate in or is participating in to support and help advance the ongoing positive transformations that you've cited?
I think that both Cassandra and the African Development Bank have spoken about where the constraints are. I think it is in the macro infrastructure, such as the supply of energy, the supply of transport infrastructure, And then I think that at the secondary level, it is the beneficiation. Because I think ultimately the defeat of blood diamonds is the beneficiation of those diamonds in the countries of origin, turning it into jewelry and all of those kind of things. So I think that those are some of the key investment directions that we should be looking at. I think other than a propaganda role for the diaspora to be people who propagate the good news of Africa, the returns on investment. For the first time, you've got empirical evidence that supports the emotional attachments that I think have been there. And that's why I thought that I would err on the side of being empiricist as opposed to propagandist in the way I would present Africa. So I think that there's that. I think that there's a timidity, particularly in the US market, about making the step towards Africa, and I say this with all the diplomacy that I can muster. I think that we cannot leave China uncontested in Africa. I think that what we need is a counterbalance, because at the end of the day, one-way traffic doesn't help us. I think that we need that, and particularly we need to counterbalance an extractive approach to Africa towards an approach that establishing manufacturing and beneficiation capacities within Africa. We've got to absorb the emerging, burgeoning generation of young Africans, to give them the skills, to employ them, otherwise they become the world's problems. And I think that it's really that role that the diaspora has to advocate for as we go forward. And then I think that there's the ongoing pressure by the diaspora for all Africa to get its act together, so that we don't allow Cassandra to cherry pick countries that meet the criteria. We have to solve both the chicken and the egg situation, because there are some who argue that while you don't reach those, you deepen the competition for scarce resources through corruption and other things like that. So I think some of us have to grasp the nettle and deal with both the chicken and the egg at the same time, because otherwise you will have pockets of excellence that will become effectively magnets for the African migratory community, and denude the home country of all of those kind of skills and energy and human resources.
Yes, Cassandra.
I just, a point taken by the ambassador's point is well taken, and I just wanted about cherry picking. As I said, the Millennium Challenge Corporation has a selective approach where we look for policy performance. But one of the things that we're actually finding, Mr. Ambassador, and I'll share that with the audience, is that we're seeing what we call the MCC effect, where we're seeing countries that might not have qualified for an MCC grant that are doing things on the policy reform side that they know that they need to do in order to qualify. So I think that, so even though we don't work with all countries on the continent, because all countries aren't performing on the policy side to the extent that they need to, or we believe they need to, we are seeing countries that see the success of other countries that do perform well and do receive our funding, and that it is having a positive impact, and we're seeing important reforms happening. So we can't be everything to all countries, but we are seeing a positive effect from the work that we're doing in other countries.
And Cassandra, there's a question for you about the MCC policies. It says, in the past, these have been criticized for requiring countries to implement policies that promote liberalization but are harmful to long-term development. What are the current microeconomic conditions required for participation in MCC programs?
Well, I would have to actually disagree with the question and the premise that our policies are, we believe the policy reforms that we focus on do actually, in fact, promote sustainable long-term economic growth. So I would disagree with the idea that the policies that we've been focusing on are leading to destabilization in the long term. So I would just have to disagree with the premise of the question.
Okay. We have a question about the role of, that students can play in critical issues facing Africa, recalling the role of the divestment movement that helped change South Africa. Maybe, Darius, you could say something about, does AfriCare engage with students in the United States and in general, more broadly, your public support, your public engagement here, and how that connects to the work you're doing in 35 African countries?
Sure. We do directly through internship programs, of course, but also through some of the programs on the continent where we are reaching out to youth in agriculture in particular, trying to get youth involved in the agricultural sector to address the challenge of rural-urban migration. But, you know, I will be honest with you, next week is the MDG Summit. I personally am very worried about where we're headed 2015. If you look at the progress that's been made, especially for Africa, that it's very much a half-full story. Tremendous amount of work that needs to be done by developed country governments, by African governments to accelerate progress to the MDGs. I would hope that students take this up because this, if not done well, could be a global failure for countries now to have dug deep to try and focus on progress against the MDGs and to see where we are. With tremendous progress, MDG 1, which for many countries, tremendous progress was being made on the income goal. But on poverty, you look at the food price spikes of 2008, what we are seeing as we speak puts at great risk the progress that many countries have made and an increase in poverty across the continent and hunger, which we know damns the next generation to long-term challenges of development. So I would hope young people seize some of these global issues, just as in an earlier time, we focused on the challenge of liberation in Southern Africa. I believe this is the development challenge of our time. And we all know, as the ambassador and all of my colleagues have said, in many ways, this is Africa's time. Tremendous progress has been made, tremendous opportunities, but very grave challenges. I would hope that students help hold all of our feet to the fire, the entire global community, about the challenge of stepping up to ensure that we are all bringing our best efforts, our A game, to the challenge of Africa's development, because it's at the center of global growth, and it's the right thing to do.
Did you want to add anything? Okay, let me keep you at the mic just a minute with another question, because you talked about AfriCare's work with women in Africa, and we have a question about why did it take so long for the international community to focus on women as a vital piece or as having a vital role in development? Is this now a trend, and is it led by funding? So could you start off, and maybe others could say, or do you think that this has been a long time coming?
Oh, it's most certainly, but I think what people recognize is it's not just a moral issue. I'll just give you my view. It's not a moral issue only, that it is absolutely front and center to the challenge of development. In order to see that these programs that we're all supporting have the kind of impact that's needed to help countries make progress against the Millennium Development Goals, it is women who are, as I said in my short remarks, who have to be front and center of these programs, given the important role they play in water, in health, in agriculture. It's absolutely essential. And those are the three MDGs, everybody is aware, that are probably at greatest risk. So it is absolutely central, and I think there's widespread recognition that this needs to be done. Let me just say one last word about this, which is the importance of marrying a lot of these national level programs, which institutions like the African Development Bank, MCC, support, with the importance of bottom-up efforts. What needs to happen village by village, community by community, to help lift people out of poverty, help them lift themselves out of poverty. So, sorry, it's a long-winded answer. I think it's very important that we all mainstream gender into absolutely everything that we do. Now, that doesn't mean simply a focus on women, in my view. Very important is the role of men. Men have to hold up their half of the sky. If you look at HIV/AIDS, we're doing work in Nigeria, for example, of getting male volunteers to go out community by community and talk to men about what their responsibility is. So gender, I think it's on both sides, we must work.
And at the MCC, let's ask
I
about Ginger, but specifically there's a question here, how can African women in the United States take advantage of MCC programs in countries of Africa? So you want to address gender and MCC more broadly?
Well, it's certainly, Reed, thank you. It is an area that I've been focusing on at the Millennium Challenge Corporation, and as Darius said, it's not just a moral issue. We know that one of the most significant constraints to economic growth in developing countries is gender inequality. And that unless we address gender inequality, we're not going to see the kind of long-term sustainable economic growth that we need to see. Someone said that when the story of development is written, the transition point where progress was made will be the empowerment of women. And that's where you're going to see the real growth. And also to my colleague Darius, it's not just about women. When we talk about gender equality, when we talk about our gender policy at MCC, we are also looking at the constraints that might have an impact on men, that prevents them from being able to contribute to economic growth in their country, to their own prosperity. So this is an issue that's very important for us. We're actually doing a roundtable discussion next week at the UN General Assembly meetings with some first ladies from the continent, and also bringing together some colleagues from the White House, from the State Department, to talk about these issues, actually from other development organizations, international development organizations, to talk about these issues. So we at MCC definitely want to put the issue front and center. We see ourselves in a leadership role. In fact, we do have a cutting-edge policy on the issue across the U.S. government and across the international community, quite frankly. I think that what U.S. women can do, and I think that they can look at what we're doing and advance the ball in forwarding these issues. And I think that would go a long way to achieving our goals.
Yeah.
Yeah, just a quick add-on to that. I think that I concur completely with the point that it's beyond the moral and the ideological issue, the issue of gender equality. I think that in the undoing of some of the most pernicious precepts of patriarchy that we have all inherited, I think we're beginning to see a completely different way forward. The experiments with cash transfers directly to women as child support grants in South Africa have had an enormous effect on moving against poverty and disease like we've never seen before. I think that micro-lending, directed particularly at women, not only has the highest rate of repayment, but the best utilization of that money for development purposes. And I think that it's, and women in the US, if there's one thing that I think that we should be advocating for and giving shape to, it is to direct parts of the transfers of money that come to Africa into micro-lending projects that aim at women in order to overcome issues of food security, issues of disease, and so forth. And the last thing is that the exciting thing about where the experiments are going and the research is going in fighting HIV and AIDS through probicides and all of those things is that it transfers the responsibility, not the responsibility, but the power from men currently to women. And I'm sure that if those were to be successful, we would begin to see first the plateauing of the incidence of HIV and AIDS and then the decline, because we have put the responsibility and the power together for the first time. I just thought I'd add those kind of things.
And you're so right about the micro-lending. It's happening everywhere across Africa. The Kenyan Women's Finance Trust has been a big success, and other countries as well. We've got a question here about China, and if we're going to talk about Africa's economy, we probably should bring China in. President Zuma has just come back with, and not only did he go to China on a visit, but he took a big delegation of business executives, and I believe quite a lot of business was done on the trip. So I'd like for you, Ambassador, and perhaps the African Development Bank perspective also on what role China is playing today and where is the economic focus coming?
Please.
Let me give the more political perspective, and you can have the better one. Look, I think that what has happened in the last decade or so has been phenomenal in terms of China's entry onto the African continent. China, I think, has effectively replaced the traditional lending institutions like the World Bank and the IMF as the key lender of capital for development in Africa. Secondly, China has moved in, up till 2006, 2007, had moved $19 billion worth of infrastructural development into Africa. It's become the biggest trading partner in terms of being able to buy up raw materials and oil from Africa. That's statistically what has happened. Is it desirable to have that kind of one-way traffic? I don't think so. But in an absence where you have increasingly investors from the Western Hemisphere worrying about a whole range of different concerns, some with great legitimacy, and being absolutely cautious, you are leaving the field to what could be an extractive power. The way in which the infrastructure is developed has certain usages that facilitates the transfer of those raw materials, etc. Where the railway lines go, which ports are made deeper, which ships can come in, where the goods go to, I think. And that was the reason for my earlier comment about not leaving that field open. President Zuma's visit to China with that big delegation is such because if one wants to move from Africa's current dependence on China for infrastructure development and capital transfers and all of those kind of things to a far more balanced, you need two curves on a graph to meet at a particular point. You need a curve of dependence on China to take a downward swing, and you need a curve of investment from the Western Hemisphere to take an upward swing. It is only when the two curves meet that we can have a discussion on, is President Zuma saying China is more important than the USA? Why does he bring 9 ministers to China and he comes alone to the USA? I think that then we get rid of those debates, because then you have an objective debate about what the situation is and what the situation should be, and until the two curves meet, all of Africa will be on the curve that will transfer money, build infrastructure, and send out the goods to China. That's the reality of the situation, and that's the political perspective. But Walter, you have a far more balanced one.
I don't know about balance, but it's a complex topic, and it's fraught with minefields depending on your perspective. And actually, let me use a simple legal analogy. For a contract, you have an offer and acceptance, and consideration is exchanged. And it's presumed that people act in their best interest and that the consideration is reasonable and fair. I think, though, when it comes to China investing in Africa, there needs to be a real focus on the actual consideration that is exchanged and where the cost may disproportionately lie. Money may be coming in, but you have to ask, well, how is that money being used and who does it actually benefit? And I'll leave those of you to draw your own conclusions, but you also have to look at some of the more intangible aspects of the transaction. And from the multilateral and bilateral lending and international organizations, their loans come with conditions, which we like to think are reasonable conditions. Conditions such as gender equality. The bank, for its part, is a pioneer in assuring that when there is land in question that might be redistributed through either resettlement or some other purpose, that care is taken to assure that titling of that property is done in both spouses' names. Okay. With investments that might come from other parties, bilateral sources, there may not be such a condition. There are climate implications with AFDB and other multilateral and bilateral loans where they actually look to determine the appropriateness of an investment for that particular area. For example, should an investment that is highly water intensive take place given the climatic and the water concerns of a particular area. Such level of detail may not always be associated with investment from other parties, other countries. And if those additional, very important, essential, in my view, terms and conditions are not part of that equation or that contract, social and economic contract, then there is, I believe, a disproportionate cost borne by the Africans. And so I'm trying to be as diplomatic and as possible, but framing it in a way that gets people to look at the issue very broadly and to focus on not only just the the economic implications of the massive transfer of financing and capital, which is a good thing. But when that transfer and capital is done where one party's interests might be disproportionately benefited or the other side disproportionately or adversely impacted.
Darius, you get the last word.
Yeah, I have the great advantage of not being in any government, so I can just say what I think. Which is, look, I think the great news about China is a wake-up call to all of us. And it's not just China. Brazil has increased its exports to Africa 10 times over the last 10 years. If you saw the press report just the other day, an Indian telecommunications firm has just bought Zain, which used to be Celtel. So it's a number of other countries looking at Africa very differently. The wake-up call is when I talk to American businessmen, they look at Africa, they see risk. These other countries look at Africa, they see enormous opportunity.
Yes, right.
And it is not too late, so all of you who are in business, now is the time before it is. Yeah. Second point I would make is that, look, I think it's a tremendous responsibility on African governments to leverage these investments, this tremendous interest from the outside for the people of their countries. And that means negotiating better terms. I see an important role for the African Union to help small states figure out, because some countries have figured this out, how to get the best possible deal out of these foreign investments from Brazil, India, China. Last thing I'll say is, look, as we speak, wage rates are rising in China. China will appreciate its exchange rate. Enormous opportunity for Africa. The question is, will Africa seize it and do what it needs to take advantage of this opportunity that's been created?
Thanks. A very good note to end Africa Forging Ahead. We thank this panel. Again, please join me in thanking them. I've been asked to ask you to remain in your seats so the room can be secured for President Kiir's arrival. So please remain. Is that right? And I've been told everyone who is standing needs to be in a seat unless you're a member of the certified member of the press. Please take a seat and stay in your seat. Hey, these guys can go. You can't stay in your seats.
Oh, we must leave, right.
we have to, but the rest of the people have to stay.
Look, it could be really wonderful. Have a discussion.